Hey, what's going on, guys? It is your average programmer here. And today I want to talk about the idea of generics. Now, generics are basically a way to implement or to increase decoupling in your application. So that allows your application to be less dependent on other parts of the application. Let's take a look here. I found a very nice website, and if you don't know about Tutorials Point, it is a really good website if you want to learn any programming language. So, as you can see here, generics allow you to define the specification of the data type of programming elements in a class or method until it is actually used in a program. So this is very similar to a placeholder. You can put a placeholder in place of an actual data type, which is pretty interesting. So, in other words, generics allow you to write a class or method that can work with any data type. Now let's put these words into action. I'm going to show you guys exactly what generics are. So right under this main method here, I've just created a new project. I haven't done anything yet. This is just the default boiler template for Visual Studio. But anyway, under this method here, we're going to create another method. And this is just going to be an introduction to generics for now. After I create this method and after I show you how generics work, we are going to dive a little deeper into generics with the list class. But for now, we're going to create this method. We're going to make it a static method, and we're not going to return anything. So public static void, we are going to call it get data type. And as you might guess, the method returns the data type. In this case, it's going to return the data type of the parameter that we pass in. We're just going to call the parameter param. So let's store this result inside of a variable equals param dot get type. So let's go ahead and console.write line as well. I'm going to print out our result. All right, so as you can see here, all it does, it checks the data type of the parameter that we pass in, and then it returns the data type. All it's going to do is print out the data type of whatever parameter we pass in. So let's go ahead and call the method get data type. Let's pass in a number 45, let's say. Now let's see what data type this gives us back. All right, so we get right after this loads, we get an integer. So system.in32, we get an integer. Now let's say we want to get back the data type of the sentence. Say, hello world. As you can see here, this doesn't work. Now let's read the error and see. It says cannot convert from string to int. Now the reason we cannot print the data type of this parameter that we've passed in is because in the method we've explicitly only passed in an integer data type. So any other data type that you pass in will not work. You can only pass in a data type of integer that comes from the system.in32 class, which this string here does not come from. But I want to make this method reusable. What can I do to make this method more reusable? Well, this is where generics play a huge role. This is where generics allow you to have reusable code, allow code reusability to be high within your program. So first thing we're going to do, we're going to change this int data type into just a t. You can pass in any single letter or whatever you want to pass in as the placeholder, but the convention is just a t, which stands for type. So we've changed the explicit data type of integer to just a t because we want to make this generic. Now the next convention is to have this open and closing brackets and to pass in the t as well. So whatever data type we pass into here will be used as the data type for this parameter. So now as you can see, the squiggly line has went away. And if we print this out to the console, let's see what we get. There we go, system.string. And that's how you make your code more reusable with generics. That's the basic idea of generics. Now let's go ahead and reuse this method again so I can show you that it actually is reusable. Let's pass in just a letter. And there we go. We get the string and we get the character class. So again, generics are basically a way to make your code more reusable without specifying the data type that you want to use. Remember, we specified the integer and we could only pass in integer as into the parameter of this method. But once we use a placeholder in place of the explicit data type, we're now able to reuse our code with whatever we want. We can use a string, we can use a character, we can use a double if we want to. Let's pass in 25.4. And you'll see that we get a system.double class back, because it comes from that class. As you can see here, we can reuse this method to find the data type of any parameter that we pass in, not just integer. So now, I want to dive a little deeper into generics. Let's go ahead and create a new class. We're going to create the list class. And you may or may not be familiar, but I'm going to show you really quickly using system.collections generic. All right, here we go. When you're creating a list in C#, the normal convention to create it is this. That's how you create a list. Now, as you can see here, we've got the variable name. And in here, we've passed in a specific data type, meaning that when we create this list, we can only pass in integers into this list. But at the same time, if we create another list, this list can be of type string. Now, what I'm trying to get you to understand here is that the list class uses generics. If this wasn't true, you wouldn't be able to pass in these different data types into a list. You wouldn't be able to reuse this list class to create these different lists of different data types. As you can see, we've got a string, a list of strings, and a list of integers. Those are the basis of generics. They use the basics of generics. So let's go ahead and create this from scratch. I'm going to show you how the behind the scenes works with lists. So let's go ahead and create a list class. And let's store this class. I forgot to use the class keyword. Store this class in a new file. All right, here we go. So, oops, I didn't mean to delete what was in here. Let's get all those back. All right, there we go. So I've got that back because I'm going to reference this method again later on. But we've still got our list class. And in here, we're going to use the basics of generic. We're going to use the same convention, pass in a T, because we're going to be reusing this generic data type. So now let's go ahead and create a private array. As you can see, we've already put to use this generic data type because this array is going to be generic, so we can pass in anything we want. We can pass in integers, we can pass in strings. It doesn't matter. We're going to be able to reuse this list class for different data types. We're also going to create an indexer. And now the reason I used int explicitly and not the T over here is because the index of an item is always a number. You can't reference an item using anything else but an integer. You can't reference the index of an item using strings. It has to be an integer, which is why I explicitly put int. And the reason why I set it to the initial value of 0, you're going to see later on. I'm going to explain that to you. Now let's create a constructor for this, because inside of this constructor we want to initialize the list to a certain size. So we're going to pass in a size. As you can see, I've explicitly passed an int again because the size of an array is always an integer, or the size of a list is always an integer. It's always a number, 32-bit number. All right, so now we are going to declare a new array. Of size. So of size, the parameter that we pass in. Now let's go ahead and jump out of this constructor. So when we create a new instance of a class, we're going to pass in a size, and then a new array is going to be created with the size of the parameter that we pass in. That's all this constructor does. Initializes an array to whatever size we pass in. Now let's create the add and get methods. The add method, of course, adds in data types, or adds in objects into the list. Void add. All right, so we're going to take in a value of a generic data type. We've made use of it again. We're making use of it. So array, whatever index we're on, is going to equal value. And then we're going to increment the index. Let's say index plus plus, or index plus equals 1. Now, here's why I set the index to 0. Because when you look at an array or a list, the index of an array or list always starts off at 0. So index 0 is actually the first element, index 1 is the second element, and so forth. So when I initially call the add method, I'm going to pass in a value, and that value is going to be set to the first element, to the first index of the array, which is index 0. And then after that, index is going to be incremented to 1. And then when I call the add method again, the next value we pass in is going to be set to index 1. Because if we keep it at 0 and we don't increment index, then the element at index 0 is going to continue to be overridden, because index isn't changed. It's continuously 0, which is why we have to increment index each time we call the add method. So now we're going to go ahead and declare the get method. So we're going to retrieve an item from our list, and we're going to return a generic data type. We're going to call it get, and we're going to pass in an explicit index again. So all we want to do is return array, return the element from the index that we pass in our array. And that's it. This is the general idea of generics. And this is the behind the scenes implementation of a list class. So we've got the list class. It's a generic data type, meaning that we can pass in any data type we want. We can reuse this with different data types. So we've created an array. We've initialized it to 0 because the first element of an array starts at index 0. And then we've created a constructor because when we initialize this list, we want to pass in the size of the list, which is automatically going to set the array to that size. And then we've got the add and get methods. With the add method, we're going to pass in a value, and that value is going to be added to whatever index we're on. And then we increment index each time we call the add method. And then the get, you just pass in an index this time, not a value, but an index, and it returns the value at that index. So there you go. That's how you make use of generics. Now let's put this to use. Let's go ahead and instantiate this list. All right, so var list equals new list. Let's start off with an integer array. We're going to make it length 5. So let's go ahead and add 5 items to the list. Let's say 31. Let's that add 14. Let's that add 150. Let's that add. All we're doing is adding elements into the list. 94. Let's that add 3. All right. So now let's go ahead and get one of the elements from the list. So I'm going to call list.get. I'm going to pass in an index. So let's start with index 0, 31. If we pass in index 0, we should get 31. So let's go ahead and run this and see what we get. As you can see, we got 31 because 31 is at index 0, and which is the reason why I set the index primarily to 0. So let's call index 1 now, and we should get 14. All right, let's see what we get. Index out of bounds. Oh, I passed in the wrong thing. I'm not supposed to pass in 14. I'm supposed to pass in index 1, which is why I said out of bounds. We do not have 15 elements in the array. There we go. We get 14 back. So let's pass in, as you saw, I passed in something out of bounds of the index of the array, and it gave us an exception, which means that it works. So no need to test that again. Now let's create an array of, or a list of strings, just so I can show you how reusable this is. Let's say var list2 equals new list. I pass in strings. We're going to make this 3, keep it short. List2 dot add, say hello world. List2, I spelled list wrong here, which is why I'm getting those squiggly lines. 2 dot add goodbye world. Let's add one more. This 2 dot add just a random string. Now let's call the get method on this list, on one of the items in this list. So let's get back goodbye world, which is index 1. 0 is hello world. Index 0 is hello world. Index 1 is goodbye world. So dot get, let's pass in a 1, and let's see what we get. Oh, passed in the wrong array. So let's put list2 dot get, not list1. All right, there we go. We get goodbye world because it's at index 1. And as you can see, we made use of generics because we can reuse this method or this class for different data types. Now, I hope you understand this video. I hope it made sense to you. If it did, please be sure to subscribe as it says down here. Please be sure to subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you learned something new, tell me what you learned down in the description or down in the comments section. If you didn't understand this video, leave your questions down in the comment section as well. If you liked it, hit a like. If you want to stay tuned for more, please be sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so that you're notified whenever I post a video. I hope this made sense to you, and I hope I explained it well enough for you to understand it. Hope you all have a good one. Goodbye. Peace.